On June 7, 2024, a special gala concert took place at the Verona Arena in Italy to celebrate the recent inscription of Italian opera singing in UNESCO's lists of Intangible Cultural Heritage, or ICH. The program for the night included arias and overtures from famous operas by Verdi, Rossini, Puccini, and other Italian composers, interpreted by celebrated opera artists and interspersed with choreographic intermissions. The event was organized by the Italian Ministry of Culture and broadcast across the entire European Union by RAI, the Italian National Broadcasting Company. The highest representatives of the Italian government were in attendance, including Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the President of Italy, Sergio Mattarella. The title of the concert, The Great Italian Opera as Humanity's Heritage, or La Grande Opera Italiana Patrimonio dell'Umanità in Italian, suggested that the object of UNESCO's acknowledgement is indeed Italian opera. But this is misleading. What UNESCO officially inscribed in its lists was the practice of opera singing in Italy. There are, of course, important differences. While Italian opera is a musical genre characterized by the use of the Italian language and the adoption of certain stylistic and formal features, opera singing in Italy is a cultural practice tied to a specific geographical context, but not to any language or musical style in particular. To further complicate things, UNESCO's official description of the practice of opera singing in Italy never mentions the practice as such, instead referring to it as Italian opera singing, as if every opera artist in Italy sang Italian opera only. Such semantic slipperiness worked to the advantage of the Italian government and the other organizers of the gala concert, who leveraged UNESCO's prestigious seal to promote a glorification of a particular historical narrative concerning not opera singing in Italy, but rather Italian opera, and more specifically its presumed place in present-day Italian culture. Such a narrative fits well within the ideological agenda of Meloni's far-right administration, constantly engaged in defending Italians' presumed cultural and racial identity against the perceived threats posed by globalization and immigration. But as it often happens with UNESCO applications, the nomination involved the concerted efforts of multiple stakeholders of different political stripes over a multi-year process. The institutions and organizations supporting or involved in the Committee for the Safeguard of the Art of Italian Opera Singing, or Comitato per la Salvaguardia dell'Arte del Canto Lirico Italiano, the Ministry of Culture-backed task force in charge of the drafting of the proposal and the monitoring of the application process, also cannot be easily pinpointed to any specific political affiliation. Their list includes organizations of opera professionals, societies representing Italian opera houses, archives and research centers tied to music publishers or to Italian opera composers such as Verdi, Donizetti, Rossini and Puccini, and music conservatoires. Some Italian music historians, influenced by current anthropological and ethnomusicological debates in Italy and abroad around cultural sustainability, have expressed concerns over the possible negative consequences of the inscription of Italian opera singing in UNESCO's lists. Emilio Sala, for instance, has recently written about the unintended museification that Italian opera singing would undergo once it is treated as a geographically located musical tradition associated with Italian cultural identity. Such an attitude towards Italian opera, Sala observes, quote, ends up assigning an excessive significance to issues of identity, which are in turn strictly connected with the problem of authenticity and with a sort of self-ethnicization for nationalistic purposes. End of quote. I share Sala's concerns about the colonialist implications of the Italy-centric vision of Italian opera singing sanctioned by UNESCO. But for the purpose of this paper, I am interested in exploring the reasons pushing a multitude of Italian opera professionals pursuing different cultural and political goals to craft and institutionalize this historical narrative. To investigate these reasons, I conducted 25 interviews with Italian music historians, singing teachers, theater managers, opera singers, directors, and composers between February and August 2024. In agreement with my interlocutors, the interviews were anonymized in an effort to create a space where they could express their opinions independently from the organization and institutions with which they collaborate. As it emerged during the interviews, opera professionals in Italy cultivate rather consistent ideas about Italian opera singing depending on the category to which they belong. The historical narratives deriving from each of these groups tend not to intersect with one another. Instead, they appear as autonomous manifestations of the standpoint and political goals of each category of opera professionals. These narratives are often in contrast with the nationalistic understanding of Italian opera singing presented in the UNESCO application. Nevertheless, With only one exception, all the interviewees supported the intangible cultural status application because of the benefits that UNESCO's seal of approval promises to bring to their profession or to the Italian operatic circuit. This is perhaps inevitable. In his classic essay, The Politics of Historical Interpretation from 1982, historian Aidan White has questioned the possibility and even the desirability of a kind of history that claims to be above political ideology. As White puts it, quote, "One must face the fact that when it comes to apprehending the historical record, there are no grounds to be found in the historical record itself for preferring one way of construing its meaning over another." Unquote. In the case of Italian opera, while historical facts such as the origin of the genre in Italy, the use of the Italian language, or the presence of a wide network of large and small opera houses across Italian territory cannot be disputed, the meaning of these facts changes according to the perspective of who is stringing them together into a historical narrative. Positivistic notions of the historical enterprise as a neutral reconstruction of the past, White argues, can only, quote, emanate from centers of established political power and social authority, end quote, including the universities and the cultural institutions that are responsible for the transformation of history into a purportedly scientific discipline. Such a vision of history, White continues, cannot work to the advantage of, quote, subordinate, emergent, or resistant social groups, for whom the recommendation that they view history with objectivity, modesty, realism, and social responsibility can only appear as another aspect of the ideology that they are indentured to oppose, end quote. As a music historian working in an Italian university, I must acknowledge that my ideas on the current cultural and political role of Italian opera in Italy and in the world are informed by my own privileged positionality within an established institution invested with a special cultural authority. This positionality allows me, among other things, to deconstruct the different narratives about Italian opera presented by my interviews without replacing them with any narrative of my own, except for the perhaps unsurprising argument that since there is no unequivocal definition of Italian opera singing or even Italian opera, it is impossible to tie Italian opera performative traditions to any particular national context. After all, I have never found myself in the position of having to believe in an Italy-centered historical narrative about Italian opera to defend my own profession or to find motivations to practice it. In this paper, my goal is thus not to debunk nationalist UNESCO-sanctioned myths about Italian opera, but rather to investigate why such historical narratives came to be and who they promise to empower. The narrative about Italian opera that the Committee for the Safeguard of the Art of Italian Opera Singing presented to UNESCO with its application dossier is not unlike the one that could be found in any college-level Western art music history manual. According to that story, the musical genre that eventually came to be known as opera emerged during the early Baroque period in courts and aristocratic organizations in what is today central Italy. Over the years, upper classes' interest in the new form of musical theatre resulted in the creation of a network of privately owned opera houses in Italy and abroad. In the following centuries, developments in transportation and the emergence of new musical media were instrumental to the international success of several generations of Italian composers, ranging from Jomelli, Porpora, Cimarosa and Cherubini to Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, Verdi and Puccini. In the ICH application dossier, this rather canonical historical account provides a foundation to the claim that Italy has always had a central significance in the promotion of Italian opera singing because of a series of circumstances that are supposedly unique to the country and its culture. Italian opera singing is described as resulting from the coordinated use of, quote, 3 anatomical districts corresponding to the respiratory system, the larynx vocal cords, and the vocal tract, end quote. The matching of the musical notes, quote, with the articulation of the phonemes of the Italian language, end quote, is supposedly instrumental to this process of coordination, since, quote, Italian is a kind of connected speech, end quote. A separate article penned by some of the proponents of the UNESCO application further stresses the essential role that the Italian language played in the emergence of this singing style. In it, the authors describe Italian as a uniquely musical language because of the regular alternation of vocalic and consonantic sounds, which allows for the connection of different words and facilitates musical phrasing. In the application dossier, the practice of Italian opera singing remains strictly connected with Italian conservatoires, universities, and musical academies. Within these institutions, the teaching and learning of Italian opera singing is described as taking place orally through a direct relationship between the student and the singing teacher. Students are also trained to act on stage, quote, in a manner consistent with the gestures and traditional proxemics, as well as the emotional and psychological adherence, unquote, to the characters they impersonate. In fact, the facial and gestural mimicry accompanied by emission of sound, unquote, are described in the document as a typical Italian feature of Italian opera singing, since the Italian language, quote, makes use of a facial and bodily mimic and gestural language to better support vocal emission and facilitate the sharing of meanings and emotional archetypes with the public, end quote. The musicologists that I interviewed generally agree with the historical account about the birth, development, and international success of Italian opera and Italian opera singing provided by the ICH application dossier. But in general, their interpretation of these historical events differs substantially from the one presented in the document. With only one exception, the musicologists I talked to, including some who personally signed the UNESCO application, argue that Italian opera and Italian opera singing have always circulated abroad, producing musical repertoires and traditions that cannot be traced back to a single national context. In fact, they argue, Italian opera and Italian opera singing are probably more cultivated abroad than they are in Italy today. Indeed, a quick glance at international operatic databases reveals that the number of Italian opera productions that have recently appeared in Italy is lower than the number of Italian opera productions presented in other European countries in the same years. After all, musicologists ask, what does it even mean to talk about Italian opera when famous works in the repertoire, such as, for example, Mozart's Italian opera buffas, were written by foreign composers and first produced abroad, or when Italian composers such as Rossini and Verdi composed operas in languages other than Italian? And what is Italian opera singing itself? As I point out, Baroque recitar cantando could be hardly compared to 19th and 20th century bel canto or verismo singing. Foreign-born theorists like Manuel Garcia have had an important impact on the development of Italian singing, and the opera artist most frequently associated with Italian opera singing in current-day Italian popular culture, Maria Callas, was born in New York to Greek immigrant parents. The study of vocal performance is not particularly cultivated by Italian musicologists, and those who do write about this topic tend to focus on specific periods, and especially the 19th century, instead of considering the historical development of opera singing in Italy from the birth of this genre until today. Singing teachers, on the other hand, have often written on the history of Italian opera singing also because of the large number of students who still come to Italy from abroad hoping to gain first-hand exposure to the Italian singing style. Unlike many music historians who remain skeptical about the existence of a historical continuity in Italian opera singing, all the singing teachers I interviewed maintain that it is possible to find a shared approach to operatic vocality in Italian singing treatises dating from the 16th to the late 18th century. While singing teachers concur on the definition and historical continuity in Italian opera singing, however, their opinions regarding the current practice of Italian singing style in Italian conservatoires differ considerably. Those who are close to the committee that drafted the UNESCO application dossier argue that because the development of Italian opera singing is necessarily connected with the supposed musicality of the Italian language, an argument dating back at least to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, only Italian or Italian-speaking maestri can provide an adequate training. In fact, they claim that one of the reasons motivating the UNESCO application in the first place was the perceived need to preserve the authentic teaching tradition of Italian opera singing in Italy, which, in their opinion, has been negatively affected by a recent reform of music curricula of Italian conservatoires that reduced the weekly hours devoted to its practice. Singing teachers who question the significance of the intangible cultural heritage status for Italian opera singing also agree that Italian musical institutions struggle to train new generations of opera artists, but for very different reasons. In their opinion, present-day pedagogical methods adopted in Italy ignore the principles of the great Italian singing tradition as they are described in 18th and 19th century treatises. According to these teachers, an interest in manuals of the Italian singing tradition is more cultivated abroad than it is in Italy. In fact, they claim, not only do excellent singing schools exist in other European countries or in the US, but as demonstrated by non-Italian repertoires such as the German Lieder, the Italian singing style can be fruitfully adapted to any language, not just Italian. Italian opera artists affiliated with Assolitica, an organization representing Italian opera professionals, are especially supportive of the inclusion of Italian opera singing in UNESCO's lists. This is hardly surprising. In 2013, another opera singers organization from which our Assolitica would later emerge, unsuccessfully petitioned the Italian government to nominate Italian opera as such to be inscribed in UNESCO's lists. 6 years later, Assolica's managers will remain responsible for the new ICH application, this time nominating the art of Italian opera singing instead of Italian opera to better respond to UNESCO's commitment to the safeguard of cultural practices tied to specific communities instead of globally circulating cultural products or repertoires. When I inquired with Assolirica members about similarities and differences between the 2013 and the 2022 ICH applications, they responded that the overall purpose of the two applications was the same: to safeguard a musical heritage that they perceived to be at risk because of the cultural marginalization of Italian opera in Italian society. As they point out, Italian opera is not part of the Italian public education curriculum, which only devotes a very limited number of hours per week to music up to the middle school years and none at all in almost high school programs. As a consequence, my interviews lament, Italians only get limited exposure to their own nation's operatic cultural heritage. This is reflected on the composition of current-day singing classes in Italian conservatoires and singing academies, which they say is made up of up to 90% of foreign and especially Chinese students attracted by Italy's perceived allure as the motherland of Italian opera. While my interlocutors insist that students' nationality does not matter so long as the practice of Italian opera singing lives on in Italy or even abroad, they admit that the political goal of the UNESCO application was to pressure the Italian government to invest in the promotion of the Italian operatic tradition among Italian citizens. Indeed, a 2006 law, number 77, mandates the Italian Ministry of Culture to devote regular financial support to the cultural practice that achieve ICH status. Members of the committee that submitted the ICH application acknowledged that the success of their initiative was primarily due to the direct involvement of the Italian Ministry of Culture and the theatre managers of major opera houses, who are in turn appointed after they are approved by the ministry. Because of this, they see the gala concert at the Verona Arena as the culmination of a longer process of political appropriation of the ICH status on the part of Italian lawmakers of every political stripe. While their opinion of the concert is generally positive, some of my interviewees are critical of the concert's implied message. As one composer wondered, what is the idea of Italian opera that this event conveyed to its audience, when the most recent operas from which the arias are excerpted were composed more than 100 years ago? Similar program choices, he laments, risk transforming opera singing in Italy from a developing tradition into a craft aiming at preserving the presumed authenticity of a musical repertoire perceived as dead. For certain, the Verona Arena concert put on display both the benefits that UNESCO's acknowledgement promises to bring to the international visibility of Italian opera and Italy itself, and the risks connected with the possible crystallization of the repertoire and the musical practices surrounding it. Yet, although the granting of ICH status to a given cultural tradition apparently entails at least a shared understanding of the tradition itself on the part of those who practice it, the interviews I presented in this paper show that Italian opera professionals cannot agree on any univocal definition neither of the practice of Italian opera singing in Italy, nor of the musical genre, Italian opera, to which this practice refers. But the absence of a shared understanding of Italian opera singing does not mean that music historians' vision of this practice as an indefinable musical tradition with no unique connection with Italy is necessarily viable. In fact, as I have shown, no deconstructionist approach to the study of historical narratives can be of service to the utopian drive pushing singing teachers, opera artists, theatre directors, and other opera practitioners as they attempt to assert the relevance of their own profession in present-day Italy. After all, it is precisely the diversity of the interpretations of historical facts about Italian opera singing that allows for the proliferation of approaches and attitudes towards its practice in present-day Italy, and thus for its ongoing reinterpretation as a living cultural tradition. Thank you for watching.